This video will be introducing you to the concept of exception handling in Python. So exceptions are something that we've encountered many times since the beginning of the semester. For example, what if we did something like this? Let's say a is equal to 5, b is equal to 0, c is equal to a divided by b. Now you know that you're really not supposed to divide a number by 0 because we can't adequately compute the answer, and Python is no different than us, and when we run this, we're going to raise an exception, and the exception is a division by 0 exception. So we know about exceptions, and we know that they're these angry little messages that appear that cause our program to end, and they're technically indicative of a runtime error, which is an error that causes our program to prematurely end. So there are a couple of ways you can handle exceptions. The first way to handle exceptions would be to use a series of if statements to prevent them from happening in the first place. So for example, in this program, if we wanted to prevent this from happening, let's get two numbers from the user. A is equal to int of input of num1, and b is equal to int of input of num2. So we got two numbers here, and c is equal to a divided by b. Now the user could type in anything they want. We know that, most times it'll probably be okay, but every once in a while, if the user types in a 0 for b, we're going to run into an issue. So one thing we could do is we could protect ourselves using an if statement. We can say, make sure b is not a 0. So if b not equal to 0, then we can go ahead and do this, and this will protect us at this point, right? So we're not even going to get into that if statement if b is equal to 0. So that's one way we can handle exceptions, and that's a good faith effort that you should make as a programmer to prevent exceptions from happening in the first place, but it isn't always going to work. So this would prevent the division by 0 exception for sure. If I run this program and I put in 1 and 0 now, the program's no longer going to crash because we're just going to skip by that if statement. But what if I tried this? What if I did this? 1 and apple. We still crashed. And the reason why is we attempted to convert the string apple into an integer, and that's not a valid data type conversion. There's nothing we could have done with an if statement really that would have solved it. Well, I guess we could have tested the string to see if the string was only numeric characters, and only then we could have converted it to an integer. That would have been one way to do it. But there will be times where, say, for example, you're designing a mobile application. You're attempting to access the internet, and the user is walking down into the subway, and the internet is not available. That would probably raise an exception on your phone saying, network not available, error, and you would have to do something with that. So how do we deal with exceptions in a formal way in Python? So here's what we do. I'm going to start over here, write a new program. Let's say we have a line that could potentially cause problems. So step one when handling exceptions is to identify questionable lines of code. So this line right here, a is equal to float of input of enter a number. So we know that if the user enters the number 5.5, that will be an OK statement, or 7.8, or whatever. But if the user enters the string apple, we know that an exception is going to be raised because converting apple to a float is not a valid operation. So what can we do? Well, what we could do is we could say, all right, this line might be trouble, so let's isolate it. So if we have a line that potentially could cause us problems, what we could do is we could put it inside of this block called a try block. So a try block kind of looks like an if statement, but there's no condition attached to it. You just type try : and then you indent and you place the statements that are going to be attempted underneath that try block. So what happens here is Python will provisionally execute those statements. If there's no problem, then there's no problem, and the program will continue as is. If there is a problem, Python will give you, the programmer, the chance to respond to that problem before the program crashes. And you can actually prevent the program from crashing. So let's say the user enters in a bad number there and we're unable to convert it to a float. How do we deal with it? So what we do is we put another block down here, and this is called our except block. Except block. This happens if an error was detected in the try block. Except : and then print bad user. There we go. So a try block provisionally runs statements, and except block will be used to catch those errors. And then directly after that, we can just have our program go as is. Print hello, okay, all done. There we go. Let's run this program. So if I run this program with the number 5.5, that's a valid floating point number. No exception is going to be raised. So we just get the string, okay, all done. All right, looks good. Now let's run our program. And we're going to run the program now with the number apple. Well, we can't really convert apple to a float. So what's going to happen? We get the string bad user and then okay, all done. But notice we do not get an exception being raised. And the reason why is we caught that exception. That exception was thrown by Python, and we were able to catch it inside of this block called the except block. So we'll provisionally execute these things. If there's a problem, we jump down here, we resolve the problem here, and then we continue with our program as is. Now notice here, if I was to have a print statement here, print right after the input statement. Watch this. If I run this program here, and I give it a good number like 5.5, the output is 5.5 right after the input statement, okay, all done. And that makes sense. We ran this line, there was no error. We ran this line, there was no error. We skip this because there was no error, and we continue with our program. However, if I put in a bad thing, like apple again, we only get bad user and okay, all done. So what happened here? There was an exception here. We immediately stopped, and we jumped down here. We didn't give Python the opportunity to even consider to run this statement. This statement was totally skipped because there was an error here, and we jumped down here because of that. So that's how try except works. And often we'll use try except to do things like data validation or attempt to perform something risky like opening a file on the web that may not exist. We can wrap that questionable code inside of a try block and then handle the errors using the except block. One more thing you could do with try blocks is there's an optional third statement you could put here called else. And the else statement will only execute, so this executes only if there was no exception above. So if there's an exception in here, then this happens. If everything up here is totally fine, then this happens. This is like a two-way branch, right? One of these two things has to happen. If everything up here is good, then this one happens. If something up here is bad, then this one happens here. So if you want to, you can place in the optional else statement into your code. But like I said, it is optional. Often we'll just use try except in order to catch exceptional situations.